minutes. I'll try and get through it. So just to start off, the talk, I want to kind of break it into two parts. So the first part, I'm going to sort of frame the problem and provide some example solutions. So the problem being how to effectively communicate in terms of climate change, and psychological barriers being some of the issues that jump up in terms of preventing people's behavioural change and taking on new information in terms of climate change. I'm going to present some steps towards effective engagement around the issue, and then part two, I'm going to look at the New Zealand case study. So overview of the case study itself, and this communities of practice model, which is a model that we've used to try and get people to communicate, to talk to each other, to kind of break down these interdisciplinary barriers, and then some examples of how we did that and some of the issues, the important learning outcomes that came up for us when we were putting that model in place. All right. So the first section, framing the problem. So this is a graph from the Institute for Advanced Development Studies from, it's a bit old now at this stage, from 2011, I think. And it's showing the scientific evidence that climate change is primarily, current climate change is primarily induced by humans is about 97%. Yes, 3% no. Currently, I think it's moved up towards 98%. The same kind of confidence people have that smoking causes cancer. So that's where the scientific community is currently. In comparison to the media, and these are slightly old figures, but these are media figures saying that about 28% of media in the US agrees or promotes or acknowledges that climate change is a human-induced issue primarily, 72% no, and you can see the public perception kind of follows in with this and kind of mirrors it quite closely. So when you see these types of figures, you kind of ask yourself, what's going on? Is this the media issue, or is it the scientists? And I would argue that it's actually a lot to do with human psychology. Why people aren't willing to take on the idea of, or action around environment, or the idea of climate change itself. There's a guy called Robert Gifford, and he's done a lot of work on barriers associated with overcoming barriers associated with lack of positive behaviour in the climate change area, in relation to adaptation and mitigation. And he claims that climate change starts in the mind, so it's primarily cognitive issue. So I'm going to run through 7 general psychological barriers and just give a run through. And I think they're important for how scientists understand how their audiences think about these issues. So the first one is related to limited cognition. Humans are less rational than we'd like to believe often. And some of the issues here are associated with the idea of the ancient brain, so ancient man for thousands of years, just concerned with his immediate surroundings, with survival, protecting his family. And it's not wired into us to kind of look into future scenarios, to look too far into the future, to look too far outside our own immediate environment. Other issues associated with cognition are associated with uncertainty. So whether perceived uncertainty or actual uncertainty, people aren't very good at dealing with situations when there's high levels of uncertain factors happening at the time. So they're much more likely to deal with sort of immediate or certain issues and certain factors. So that's what climate change can be a difficult thing, conceptualized because of the uncertainty associated with it. Also, we've got something called judgmental discounting. So this is where you undervalue, where one has a tendency to undervalue distance or future risks. So something that may happen in 2100, 2050, people are less likely to actually think about to take action now in terms of behavioural change or in terms of action. Exception to this might be in terms of when people think of different generations, so intergenerational issues. So you might think of your kids or your grandkids, and that's what kind of sharpens people's attention. Do I want my children to have the same environmental quality as I've had? Those types of questions. Leading on from that, the second of these psychological barriers is associated with ideologies. These ideologies can be associated with political ideologies or religious ideologies. Often what occurs is what's known as system justification. So people the tendency to defend or justify the status quo, the current state of play. So the world is as it is, and I'm not interested in hearing about these potential futures and potential changes that we have to undergo. Techno-salvation is quite a nice word to give for this point. So what's the idea of geoengineering? So geoengineering, the idea that when global efforts could be set up to actually using technology to mitigate against climate change impact. So this could be, you know, for example, putting certain chemicals into the oceans to absorb CO2, or putting up solar arrays, these kind of very large, grandiose projects. So certain people will kind of put their faith in the idea that the technology can rescue us. So that's quite a high-risk strategy to follow, you could argue. Perceived risks links in with this idea of risk. So this could be financial risk. So if you engage in say, mitigating climate change or changing the way your cities are set up, adapting to potential future climate change, is going to have a significant financial cost associated with it. And is it worth putting this investment in if there's so much uncertainty? So there's a lot of risk and work involved, and especially at the moment, the way the IPCC are framing to look how they examine climate change and trying to really bring in this picture of risk into the story. Social risk. So if I would take particular action, what will my peers think? What will my community think? Kind of looking to others. And also temporal risk. So is it worth my time? Is it worth my time acting in this way or carrying out this particular behaviour? Because time is the ultimate valuable thing for most people. So why would I invest time researching to say making my house more energy efficient? I've got so many other things to do. These are the types of barriers to action. Comparisons with others I mentioned there, the idea humans are very social animals, so compare themselves, their situation with those of others is deeply ingrained within us. And social comparison and social norms, and also the importance of social networks. So there's been a lot of research carried out. A simple example where they're trying to bring in, say, a recycling scheme on a block, or a couple of blocks in a neighborhood, and they've tried 3 different methods. So one is just to put the scheme in place and to give very little advertising on it. The second method is to put the scheme in place and to drop leaflets from household to household, and really give very detailed leaflets and repetitively give out these leaflets over the course of months. The third method was to actually get people within the neighborhood to kind of go and talk to their neighbors and promote it in the coffee shops or wherever in their social communities. This method, by and large, worked much, much better than the others. And that seems quite intuitive, but it's an important aspect to remember that networks are very, very important when it comes to behavioral change and when it comes to communicating messages effectively as well. Limited behavior is another psychological barrier. So people often engage in what's known as minimal action or tokenism. So a lower cost action is much less effective than something that might be higher cost. So people may put in energy-saving light bulbs in their homes, but still the rest of their energy usage, they'll keep it the same. So maybe a more sensible, if they want to actually make a significant difference in terms of their bills or in terms of their lifestyle, they might get an audit of their home. So they might take the time to see what different appliances they're actually using in terms of electricity, rather than just this kind of token effort of changing light bulbs. And then also the idea of a rebound effect. So after mitigating effort is made, sometimes the gains are actually diminished or raised by subsequent actions. So a good example of this is people that buy energy-efficient cars or fuel-efficient cars often start to drive much more because of the perceived efficiency of the car, so then they actually do more. The credence of the second last of these psychological barriers. So this is associated with trust, and this is a huge issue that I'll come to later in the talk as well. So the idea of trust in others, or mistrust in others, this credence suggests. So it's essential for healthy relationships, and it's important in getting others to engage or to change behaviour. Examples given here are associated with perceived policy adequacy. So often it can be easier to change one's mind about the adequacy of a particular program or policy, environmental policy, than to change one's behaviour by engaging with the program. So it can be easier just to rubbish something or to knock something down because it's going to involve you changing your lifestyle. denial can come into this as well. So that's where there's high levels of uncertainty and there's mistrust. And you may also have sunk costs. So you've invested in something and you might be invested in a particular product or a particular lifestyle, so it's more difficult for you to make behavioral changes. But the final is sunk costs itself. So if people actually change their behaviors quite, or their allegiances relatively often, their lives would be more disordered than they would wish, and they have less time of effort to kind of work on their particular goals. They might also have financial investments as well that will go against behavioral change, and habit formation comes into this as well. So many habitual behaviors are really, really difficult to change permanently. So these are the kind of suite of psychological barriers associated with behavioral change, also associated with difficulty with communicating. So what we kind of need to take on board is the acceptance, I suppose, is a grandiose statement of the human condition, of the fact that human actions are often very complex, and just because there's a policy incentive or there's an economic incentive to put a particular action in place doesn't mean they're going to follow it. And this is relevant for interactions with the general public, with government officials, and with what I found as well with peers within interdisciplinary projects. So you have to take into consideration people are coming from very different places. So that was kind of the mapping out the problem space. In terms of the solution space, one important thing to know is to know your audience and your stakeholders and be able to get their attention. So what's important here, and I was talking to Carson about this earlier, is the idea of mental models. So people have a map of how they see the world. The mental model is a person's thought process for how something works. It can be a filter that results selective knowledge, uptake, and people seek out and absorb only information that fits into their mental models. So I think a good example of this is kind of the distinction between and the confusion between weather and climate. A lot of people, or a person on the street wouldn't realize the distinction between the two. So when there's, for example, been a very cold winter in New York, people will start saying, well, where's this climate change? It's been freezing for the last month, so I don't see it. But that's where it's up to scientists who might be involved communicating with the media or in terms of public outreach to kind of be able to explain the system more completely and say, okay, yeah, it's been freezing, it was a freezing winter in New York, but that's to do with the polar vortex. And then what's the polar vortex? So to kind of unpack the message and to bring people on board. So the polar temperatures, just to explain the polar vortex briefly, the temperatures in the Arctic are about 2 degrees centigrade, much more than the rest of the globe since the 60s. So the Earth's temperature has increased by about 0.7 degrees since 1900. And this temperature difference between the Arctic and the US has actually got slightly closer to each other because of this increase in the Arctic. And the jet stream is, in technical terms, is wobbling. So in non-technical terms, is wobbling. So what you're having is cold air is what happened in New York or on the East Coast is cold air is coming down, it's not moving back the way it normally would. So you're getting drops of low pressure and cold systems. So leading to a very, very cold winter in New York. But on the other hand, in St. Petersburg in Russia, they have really, really high temperatures. So that's one of the issues with climate is you have to look and take a global picture to actually get the full story, and that can be very difficult for people, as explained in the psychological barriers that people generally think their own immediate vicinity, their own proximity. In terms of knowing how to get stakeholders' attention, the important thing here is setting up the issue within an appropriate context. So framing of the issue. And that kind of moves into the next step for effective engagement. So one of the things that we've been trying to do with the project, and this is a graphic from the third US National Assessment, climate assessment, is to try and move from just talking about impacts into towards implications. So a lot of the time people talk about the rising global average sea level by the end of the century by a meter, or whatever degrees of certainty or uncertainty around it, or increased precipitation events, those types of things, increased heavy rain events. what does this actually mean for me, for my business, or for the sector I'm involved with? So this graph here is something that's quite useful to show to people and say how will effects of climate change on my core business, my core operations, the value chain, the broader network. So this could be used for a water manager or for someone in government or someone who's running a business. So to try and get people to actually attach to see how climate change may impact their day-to-day business and day-to-day lives. So moving from impact into implications. Also, what's very important in terms of effective engagement is how we manage uncertainty and risk, or how climate scientists manage uncertainty and risk. So this is Chris Field, and he's the co-chair of the IPCC, the latest report, and the Group 2 report that's come out last month, and he's based in the Carnegie Institute of Science. And this report, the Impacts, Adaptation and Vulnerability report, what they've gone out of the way to do with this report is to show how great an effort it was in terms of coordination. So you've got 436 authors contributing on 30 chapters, 12,000 references, 20,000 comments in the first draft, 28,000 in the second draft, to show the kind of robustness of approach as a way to kind of show people how seriously the report has been taken in terms of robustness, in terms of trying to manage uncertainty, and in terms of consensus. This graph is an interesting approach to try and get information across to people in a new and interesting way. It's quite a busy graph figure, but I suppose it's an alternative to the traditional. You might have a table of impacts with the countries and with the impacts listed, so it's to actually show them, distribute them across the globe. I'll take a minute or two just to look at this in a little bit more detail. So just blowing up this part of the figure. They've actually attached confidence in attribution to climate change for each of the figures that they show, each of the keys they show in the figure. So confidence in the validity of the finding based on the type of evidence they have, so the type, the amount, the quality, and consistency of the evidence that they've used. And this figure here shows how you kind of move from low agreement with most peers, limited evidence, up towards high agreement with robust evidence. So it gives the person looking at the graph an idea that there's actually uncertainties attached to each of these impacts. Then the impacts themselves, we have physical impacts here, so we impacts on glaciers and snow and ice, rivers, lakes, floods, coastal erosion, biological systems. And these have been in the last reports and reported quite widely in terms of IPCC stuff. But what's relatively new is trying to bring in human and managed systems into this figure. So trying to connect it with people's lives. I think that's what they were trying to promote, is the idea that it's not, okay, it's going to affect biodiversity or it's going to affect glaciers, but how is this going to affect me? So they're trying to bring in human systems and socioeconomic issues and food production issues that are affecting people right now. If we go back to the graph, another interesting thing, I think it's been chopped off the top of it, is that these are impacts that are occurring right now rather than projected impacts. So it's important to note that these are actually what's occurring currently around the world. And you can see that on the east coast and the west coast of the States, it's largely marine ecosystems. So they're going to have the impact currently. Other places in the world, if you go towards the poles, you see it's actually people's livelihoods. So that's where the temperature, global average temperature, is increasing most quickly. You see it's actually affecting people's livelihoods. So these types of figures, infographics are an attempt to try and communicate information more clearly in a way that might connect with people. So we've looked at uncertainty in terms of risk management. Risk is a function of likelihood and of consequence. So the likelihood can be low, the consequence is low, then you can ignore the risks. Or if you've got a very high likelihood and very high consequence, then you need to actively deal with the risks, and a combination of them. So risk is something that's very difficult it's very complicated and difficult to deal with in climate change, because you've got a lot of relatively low uncertainty with very high potential high impact risks. So it's trying to communicate that to the policy community, to the government, and to those involved in making decisions around infrastructure. So this is another way of framing it. You have a risk appetite. So you see the bottom left, you've got low risk and low likelihood. It's within the risk appetite. As you move up through towards high risk, high likelihood, see the appetite of risk. Often the issue is that climate change risks can fall within this space a relatively low likelihood or potential high impact. So this could be the collapse of Antarctic ice sheets, or melting of permafrost, some kind of tipping point event of Greenland ice melt. So it's a tipping point that will have a significant impact, but the likelihood of it is relatively uncertain. Now, to try to frame risk, what they've done is produce a graph that shows, basically on the left you see our world as it currently is, and you've got biophysical stressors, you've got a space for resilience, and you've got a space for social stressors. And in the middle panel of the figure, you can see decisions that can be made. So they've called this the opportunity space. So this is where people can make decisions, either move towards a high resilience, low risk world, or a low resilience, high risk world. And this is quite abstract, but it's kind of to get people starting to think about how they manage risk, how they look at it, the decisions they may have to mitigate against it. The fourth step in terms of effective management is around the idea of group participation and social identity. This is something that we would have looked at quite a lot in the project I'm involved with. So this is from the Climate and Urban Systems Partnership, which is funded by the NSF in the States, and the partnerships in Philadelphia, New York, and Washington. And you kind of move from the traditional science model, which will generally you produce a report, or you have information given. So you produce the information, there's the output, and then you sort of hope that it will circulate and it will impact, and it will get taken up by policy, will get taken up by society more largely. And it's trying to move towards this model where you engage, well, public feedback is often necessary for consultation, public feedback, but where you actually move towards contribution of the general public. So they will actually input their information, their knowledge, their ideas, and their priorities into scientific research. And ideally lead to what they've labeled here as empowerment. So it's an aspirational system, but it kind of gives you an idea of what type of steps you need to take to move towards engaging people more effectively. So that's the first part of the talk, and that's kind of the big picture, the problem space and the potential solution space. The second part I'm going to focus in on the project that I'm involved with, and kind of hopefully show how we've used some of these methods in terms of effective engagement, and how we've been conscious of some of the issues around potential psychological barriers. So the project that I'm involved with, the broad aim is to update and improve projections of climate trends, variability, and extremes across New Zealand itself out to 2100, based on the latest global projections. So this project was actually funded by the Ministry of Business and Innovation. So it shows that they're thinking that this is a business risk, and this is something that's going to affect the economy. So that's, I think, a healthy way to tell that they are thinking this particular local department is thinking that way. But it's a 4-year project, and the research aim that I'm involved with is looking at increasing the relevance of climate change science and decision-making capacity to consider climate change risks through collaborative learning. This whole idea of learning, collaborating, learning together. This just gives you an outline of the project, just to kind of show, in terms of the different research aims in it. The reason I'm showing this slide is just to show the scope of the project, the scale of the project. So there's 5 different research aims. The first one is looking at improving climate projections themselves. The second one is looking at identifying pressure points, critical steps, potential responses. And the way we've tackled the second research aim is to set up a number of case studies. So we have 5 case studies in different geographical locations across New Zealand. We have a coastal, a marine, alpine case study with lowland and an upland. And this is a way to engage the scientists with the stakeholders that are on the ground and to find out what they're interested in. You have to stress as well that the project involves lots of different universities. It also involves lots of different government research institutes. So there's quite a lot of different people in terms of different scientific outlooks, approaches, different political issues and personality issues and all the rest of it, and trying to get such a large group to work together. And we thought that breaking into case studies is one way to help kind of get people talking to each other. The The third research aim is looking at feedbacks and understanding and impacts and recognizing limits. This, what they've actually done here is create an economic and social economic model, so ecological economic model that kind of couples projected future climate change in with the economy of New Zealand to try and map out how climate might impact on certain sectors. So that's a kind of a modelling effort. The fourth research aim is the one I'm involved with, so capacity, increasing capacity, increasing coordination for decision making. And the fifth research aim is looking at different futures, so it's kind of a scenarios research aim. So exploring options for New Zealand under different global climates. So it's kind of moving more into that scenario space. So similar to the graph, with the figure I would have showed the different future worlds depending on what particular scenario people took. So this just breaks down, just shows an overview of the project and how the 4-year project and how these different research aims are linked together, and then research aim 4, the one I'm involved with, set up to actually coordinate across the whole project. And kind of link the different aims together and get the value in terms of linking up the different research parts of the project and parts of the project. And this figure here is a communities of practice model, and this is how, as a communication tool, as a tool to kind of help with interdisciplinary work and to help get people talking to each other. So what we've done here is we're moving from the impacts into the implication stage and all the right way through to the deciding and acting stage. So this communities of practice covers all those stages of the process, but it also covers these different steps in terms of you've got the tools and methods along the left, so they might be modeling, traditional modeling tools, scenario tools, mapping models, conceptual models, and all the different research groups are involved in setting out these impact models. Then when it comes to moving towards these implications for different stakeholders, we're actually starting to get case studies involved, we're starting to talk to local government. And the idea is that it's a co-production of knowledge system, so it's not like we, as research scientists, set out what they want to do and then move on through the process and then show the stakeholders at the end what they come up with. It's more a case that we ask near the start of the project, or at the start of the project, in fact, what issues are important to them. So we show them some of the conceptual models we might use, some of our initial outputs, and then say, are these issues the kind of issues that you were thinking about? So throughout that process, it's also, there's different things happening, there's different things in terms of levels of knowledge being developed. So a lot of this is just certain stakeholders will be quite interested and quite on board and quite keyed into the message of climate change. Others might not be at all. So it's kind of getting them up to speed and getting them to understand where they might have issues with their business. So then moving from impacts to implications, and then moving towards the deciding and acting phase of it as well. So the hope is that the 4-year project will move the output will be scientific outputs, but also the policy action, perhaps setting up new types of agencies or new types of networks, certainly. That just kind of explains it, showing that we'll just add this onto the top, so the impact, implications, deciding and acting, just examples of each. So impacts to impacts might be sea level rise, impacts on biodiversity, water resources. Implications are more actually the impacts on the climate change, impacting on critical facilities, for example, on infrastructure and ecosystems at risk, and then moving towards the decision space with what can we do, at what scale, community scale, industry scale, or government scale, and then acting on these particular decisions. That's the whole. Yeah.
Next question.
Yes.
I'm really interested in this idea of co-production knowledge. And from that chart on the bottom, it would seem that the scientists are involved in the models.
Yeah.
And they are communicating with communities or the people that would be at risk, obviously, the implications for that. But then you have another sort of cycle over there. Who are the scientists still involved in these implications, or I mean, who's co-producing in that second range?
Yeah. So the second one, this is research aims 2 and 4. So 4 is a research aim I'm involved with. So the scientists are still there. Two is kind of the case study. So the case study leaders would be involved in that second. So the second, my boss essentially is, she's had quite a lot of experience in local government, and has quite a lot more in government secretary, has quite a lot of connections. So she would be part of the research aim for. So there are scientists involved in this process. The same scientists might be fully involved in the management and intervention side of it, but there will be scientists who are involved in all three, and that's the kind of the community's practice of the research aim for.
So this is a generalized model on how to do research.
Yeah, essentially.
Right?
Yeah.
So you would want scientists at each of these three different points here: impacts, implications, and decision making.
Well, certainly the first 2 points, and then the decision making, I suppose, will involve more sectoral interests and policymakers, but you'll be interacting with them. So there might be scientists in this last group.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go on.
Do you see this process of co-production there differing in these two different parts of this?
Yeah, I go on to talk about the different issues with the kind of research to research communication, and then the research to stakeholder communication. So that's in the next couple of slides.
Fine.
But if that doesn't answer your question, we can come back to that. So yeah, I've gone through that. So these are some of the methods that we would use, or we are using. So this is traditional social science methods in terms of interviews. We've used quite a lot of Skype. We have pretty good teleconference facilities in universities. There's quite a few Skype phone calls just to kind of keep everybody in the loop. Researchers to research, more researchers actually internal conversations with different project leaders and different people involved in different research aims. Then we've used, as I said, this case study approach. So we've had these 5 different case studies. This is the local paradigm, this is the coastal case study, just south of Auckland, and including some of the urban areas in Auckland. And then a very important part of it is the idea of having workshops where kind of start to build this idea of communities of practice, where you have people feeding into the process and giving them the opportunity to kind of get involved before we've gone along the track of modeling. So I was out on a couple of weeks ago for the coastal workshop, and we had the scientists, the modelers, in terms of the coastal impacts there. Then we also had the stakeholders, and we had people from the Research Aim 4 group, so the community practice group. And it was interesting to see the conversation develop, and to see how they were, see modelers getting inputs from the different stakeholders. There were some aha moments where it's like, oh, we could couple this model with that model, that would cover these people's needs in terms of agricultural sensitivity, those kinds of things. So it's definitely a useful form for it to have. Now, the last kind of chunk of the talk, maybe 10 minutes left, looking at some of the key learning points we've got from the process so far. So, to sort of focus my talk, I had a group discussion with some of the members of the Research Aid Force of the communities of the communication and decision-making and research aid. And some of the questions we looked at were the different ways that researchers and practitioners and communicators are active, potential learning outcomes, and building capacity and decision-making, and the development of better knowledge and channels of communication through this community practice model. And the next couple of slides are kind of going to go through some of those key points and some of the important things in terms of how we set up the project. So the first, this is for within the research group itself. So very important in this project was this idea of this community of practice was put in place at the very start, at the outset, when the project was written up. What often happens from reading the literature and from some experience talking to colleagues in the UK is that you'll have a big project with lots of different, an interdisciplinary project with lots of different institutions involved. They just kind of expect there's going to be joined up collaborative work, and then reported again is going to be an interdisciplinary collaborative piece of work. That doesn't just happen, and people do tend to go into their silos and just kind of carry out their particular piece of the project, and then at the end it's just a kind of cut and paste, often a kind of cut and paste exercise. So we wanted to avoid that. So the idea was to set up these these in practice from the outset and have a significant component of the project that involved our research teams talking to each other and also getting stakeholders involved early on in setting out what impact we're going to look at. So part of this was learning to have different kinds of conversations. So there's kind of a mix of, social scientists and then more physical-based scientists. And some of the physical-based scientists will be used to kind of get on with the business and kind of looking for an interesting question, trying to answer it and work through the results. And they weren't used to, there was some skepticism around our approach. Why would we want to involve stakeholders early on? There was some fear around maybe they'll have a big long shopping list of things of impact and we won't be looking at any of them. So then what does that say? So there's this kind of conversation about, we kind of changed the way a lot of researchers were kind of thinking about how they work, how they do their science. So this, so there was a kind of a fluid and ongoing internal conversation within the research group. So through face-to-face meetings and through Skype meetings as well, the idea of having this, kind of keeping this conversation going, trying to get different people on board in terms of selling the idea of this community practice approach. And a lot of that comes down to then building trust and building capacity. So we've kind of, since I've been there, and kind of briefed by the colleagues who were there before me, there has been a kind of a slowish process over the last sort of 12 months of building trust within the research group itself, of getting people on board in terms of what we're trying to do and how it's going to add value and how we're going to, questions like how, in terms of publications, in terms of outputs, in terms of our approach, and getting people on board. And that kind of builds a capacity so that when we do have a stakeholder, when we do have a workshop, and when scientists come along, we're all kind of singing these singing from the same hymn sheet or kind of working off the same basis, so that people are kind of on board with the idea. Yes, there's different, I'm getting my point of view, there's different conceptions of science across the research group. So there's very much social scientists, physical scientists, and how science should be conducted, whether it should involve the general public, or whether it should involve stakeholders outside the research, and what are the implications of this? Do we want to go down this road? Are we willing to go down this road? So these are the kinds of questions that come up. Developing different kinds of knowledge in a broad sense, so just how we generate knowledge, maybe more different methods of generating knowledge. And the importance of a narrative is something that has come up quite a lot. So we have case studies, and we need to kind of show something to the stakeholders that captures the science and kind of ticks that box. So they have a short kind of pithy document that kind of goes through the different impacts, leading its implications, and that everybody on the team is happy that this covers off all the issues. So this is something that's circulated before the stakeholder meetings to get people up to speed on what the issues might be. And this can be quite a difficult step to get people to agree on what should be included in this narrative. And then the importance of networks and relationships. So there's quite a few existing relationships. And this might go without saying, there's quite a few existing relationships in the group, and there's a few members that are more vital in terms of this communication role than others who might have colleagues going back 10 or 20 years in a couple of different institutions are quite important to putting it all together. So these are the sort of the learning outcomes in terms of this community approach from the research team members. In terms of the stakeholders, for those, I guess, outside in the second community, in the kind of bubble, those outside the team, very important, what I found is these initial conversations that we've had. So they actually have, okay, it isn't a completely blank slate, so people have certain capacities in terms of modeling abilities they have. But there are conversations before the research, in the very early stages of the research, that actually shape the kind of outputs that we're looking for in the project. And what this does is it gives, it's very important to kind of get stakeholders involved and to get them to want to continue to be involved in the project. What this has also provided is that stakeholders have said, okay, we have this model, we have this data, we can kind of come along and give you this, use this model, the outputs in this model on this particular data set that might help complement what we're doing. That's been very valuable in terms of building capacity. So there's reports out there and there's work out there, and you can do a literature review, but sometimes you don't capture the in-house stuff as well. So it's good to kind of get access to some of this in-house modeling efforts. And then focusing on the decision process of working within existing systems. So we had a talk with someone from the dairy, interview with someone from the dairy industry in New Zealand, and we were talking about the issues for their industry, and we kind of hit on what are your existing processes for managing risk. And they said, okay, we do have quite a few processes for managing business risk to try and fit into their existing processes. So to try and fit the kind of climate change risk into existing business risk processes. Seems like something that can be quite valuable in that people don't have to completely reorganize the way they're doing their business, but they just kind of start to find the place where climate change might fit into their business, into their process. Creating a space for discussion is a really important point too. So a lot of these workshops, especially, people from local government, people from different sectors, agricultural sectors, fisheries sectors, forestry sectors, they might have the time or they might have the opportunity during the year to meet up. So these workshops actually provide a forum for people to kind of build networks that otherwise wouldn't exist, that are valuable in terms of learning. So they're very valuable networking opportunities, not only for the scientists with the stakeholders, but most of the stakeholders themselves. And some of them are kind of actively emailing us to say when the next workshop is happening. It was a great opportunity to kind of share ideas with some of our colleagues who are there to meet. Yeah, just the idea of an ongoing conversation. So it's to kind of, we were talking about this earlier in the day, it's all well and good to kind of have a project that runs up to a certain point and then finishes, but ideally we want to kind of keep these communities running, but keep momentum within them, rather than just time into the research project itself. So there is talk of expanding it out, expanding these practice communities out after the project is finished. Ownership by the stakeholders themselves. So that's linked in with the idea of these initial conversations and the length of time that the project goes on for. You kind of get stakeholders feeling that they own, they have, they're shaping the outputs, they have a sense of ownership, and they're more interested in actually what we're doing and in collaborating with them. So it's quite an important piece of the puzzle. And then moving from a problem space to a solution space. So a lot of, when people have kind of read these narratives and they've looked at what the impact might be in their particular sectoral interest, it's nice to see, okay, well, we've mapped out the problem, how can we move towards positive solutions, how can we move towards what actions can we take? People can really respond and start to get excited when they can see the connection between impacts and between solutions. So that's been interesting for me. So just the final couple of slides here. So how does this apply specifically to urban focused decision making? So a lot of the local governments in New Zealand are quite interested in urban issues in terms of climate change. So sea level rise is an obvious one, infrastructural issues. So looking at salinity in urban areas, how it might affect underground cabling, how it might affect flood defences, how it might affect effective storm drainage. And in New Zealand, there's also, obviously, this hazard associated with earthquakes, with other issues as well. So it's how they might compound the existing hazards. So that's the kind of way that local council, the local government are looking at it. How do we, and what's quite interesting is that there's quite a strong hazards and risk community, and they're not necessarily all linked with the climate change community. So I think one of the outputs of this project could be kind of aligning the hazards and risks a little more closely with the climate change stuff. And that's associated with how funding is distributed as well. So that's my talk. Thank you very much. Questions? Yeah.
So you're talking about engaging with stakeholders, which I'm assuming is firms.
They can